Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In the last video, we looked at different ways of iterating a hash map. And to be specific, we saw 5 different ways of iterating. In case you haven't already watched it, you can first finish this video and then go and watch it. And I can assure you that you will be able to understand and follow along without any problems. So in today's video, we will be understanding the difference between external and internal iteration in Java. But before we jump into the difference, we should know what is meant by iteration. And in order to understand iteration, we should know what we iterate upon or loop upon. So here we are discussing about iterating Java collection. And in simple words, a Java collection is a group of objects or elements. So for example, when you have a single value, you can store that value in a variable. But what you will do when you have bunch of values or group of values, group of objects or elements, then you need a place where you can store all these elements which will be represented as a single unit. And in that scenario, you need a Java collection. There are many inbuilt collections which are already provided by Java APIs, and some examples are array list, linked list, hash map, tree map, hash set, tree set, and many more. So now coming back to what is iteration. Iteration is navigating through each object in a collection and perform some operation on it. And this operation could be as trivial as printing the element values on the screen, or it could be extremely complex as well, like filtering and mapping the elements and performing bunch of operations on it. Let's see an example. So here we have a list of numbers, and what this for loop is doing, it is iterating through this list and printing the numbers into the console. And this is how we have been doing iteration historically, and such iteration is known as external iteration. Okay, so let us take this example as a base and try and understand why this way of iterating is termed as external iteration. So if you take a look at this picture, on the left hand side we have a collection which contains n number of elements, and it is this collection which we want to iterate upon. And on the right hand side we have action or application supplied code, and action determines what operation we want to do for each element in the collection. And finally we have this middle forEach block which tells how to do the iteration. So the very first thing to notice here is iteration is happening outside of the collection, and we are also taking responsibility of defining how to do the iteration. What that means is the programmer or the developer is not only defining the operation which we want to do for each element in the collection, but are also taking burden of completely controlling the iteration. And having more control is not always good, because more control may lead to more bugs. We will take a look at some example of this in a minute, but before that, the other limitation we have to live with is this iteration is always sequential, which of course doesn't bother us if we have just tens or hundreds of elements in the collection. But imagine if we have millions of elements. In that case, won't we desire to have parallel iteration? And to achieve that, since we ourselves control the iteration, we have to make it parallel. And let me tell you, making code execute with multiple threads is not very pleasing task to do. Okay, so now let's take a look at different ways of external iterations. And in every example, you will notice that the focus is more on how instead of what. So what we have over here is a list of numbers, and the first way of external iteration is using for loop. And if you take a look at this code, there are many places where you can make a mistake, because the first thing you have to do is you have to initialize the counter, then you have to set the boundary conditions correctly, then you have to increment or decrement the counter. But the actual or real thing which you want to do is you want to print the number on the console. But you have to deal with all this ceremonious code in order to achieve that. The second way is using enhanced for loop or for each loop, and comparatively this is much better and looks cleaner, but this is only syntactic sugar over this iterator code. And behind the scenes, the for each loop is doing iteration. It is getting the iterator using collection and then using has next and next methods to print the number on the console. So until Java 7, we had these way of iterating a collection. We were using one of these three methods, either for loop or enhanced for loop or iterators. But things got changed with Java 8. Java 8 introduced a new way of iterating over collection, which is known as internal iteration. So now that we know and understand external iteration, let us understand what is internal iteration, an alternate way of iteration which got introduced with Java 8. So if you take a look at this picture which illustrates internal iteration, the first thing to notice is looping is internal to the collection. The developer is only specifying action, that is what to do, and is not defining how to do the iteration. So it is pretty clear that focus is more on what to do and not how to do. Instead, it is collections for each method which gets to decide how to do the iteration. What that means is we as a developer are only defining action, and we tell collections for each method what we want to do with each element in the collection, and it is left to the implementation of for each method decide how to iterate. So in simple words, it is not developer who decides how to iterate. Instead, it is underlying library which gets to decide how to perform iteration. And this means that control is handed over from developer to the collection itself. And that's good, because less control often means fewer bugs. The last thing to notice is, since control of iteration is with collection itself, collection can decide based on the context how to do the iteration, which could be sequential iteration, or if conditions are favorable, then concurrent iteration. So you see, switching from external to internal iteration opens the door for so many opportunities. So let's now see how to do internal iteration in code. So here we again have a list of numbers, and the internal iteration is done with one simple line. We call for each method on the collection itself and pass the action to the for each method, which here is a simple sysout statement, and that will print each number in the list to the console. Now that we understand both external iteration and internal iteration, let's try and see what are the advantages of using internal iteration. So the one advantage which is pretty obvious from this code snippet is improved code readability. So the code on the left hand side is external iteration, whereas code on the right hand side is internal iteration. And you won't take more than a second to understand that the code on the right hand side looks much cleaner, concise and beautiful when compared with the code on the left hand side, which is external iteration. So the second advantage is transparent optimization, and these optimizations are handled by the underlying library, and as a developer we don't have to bother about it. So the library can decide to do the iteration sequentially or parallelly, based on the context, based on the conditions. If conditions are favorable, then it can go with parallel iteration. Instead, it can go with sequential iteration. So the last advantage is less control leads to fewer bugs. So internal iteration leads to less control because the iteration is controlled by the collection itself. So as a developer, we are losing control, and often losing control or having less control leads to fewer bugs because we don't have to deal with all the ceremonious code which for loop comes with, like loop counter initialization or boundary checks or incrementing, decrementing the loop counter. So these were the few advantages which we get with internal iteration. The advantages of internal iteration may not be evident from examples we saw, but let me tell you, when it comes to complex operation on the collections, internal iteration is the way to go. And in fact, Java streams use internal iteration all over the place in Java API. I hope difference between external and internal iteration is clear to you guys now. If this video was useful, then please do give it a thumbs up. Also, if you like this video, then in most possibility you will like other content on this channel as well. So please do stick around and consider subscribing. Goodbye. See you next time.